Get started tonight. Tonight we're gonna just start with a prayer, and then I'm gonna turn things over to Peter, who's got lots of information ready for us tonight. I'm so happy that he's willing to share with us, and he's gonna tell you a little bit more about himself a little bit as he gets started. I've kind of known about Peter for a few years, couple years. Heard him on several different podcasts, and I just think it's great. He's a local guy. You know, he lives in Philomath, so he's not far away. Worked for OSU, and so got those connections. And I think it's just great. He's willing to be part of our conversation and sharing his knowledge with us. And so let's begin with a word of prayer. Gracious and loving God, we give you thanks for this day. We give you thanks for the many ways that you speak to us through friends and neighbors, through new acquaintances, through people that we meet along the way. We give you thanks for the ability that you've given us to learn and to grow and to think and to respond to all that we take in each day. And we ask that you bless us in our time together tonight, help our ears to be open and our hearts to be ready to receive anything new we might hear today. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so Peter, I'm leaving it up to you.
All righty. Was it just last week that we had snow?
It was just last week we had snow, yeah.
Time flies.
You had no power.
Yep. We lost power for about 2.5 hours just a week ago. So, good evening, everyone.
Hi.
As Pastor Steve said, my name is Peter Ballerstedt, and I just want to talk a little bit about some ideas, and hopefully they'll connect with what Pastor Steve has talked about the last 3 weeks. I love the title, The Ologies of Food. And by the way, this is a picture of Ecuador, lest we think that only in the wild west of the US do we run cattle. Why are you not working? Now you're working. Okay. So my background is I'm a forage agronomist, ruminant nutritionist by training. So that means, for people who aren't familiar, that I was trained in the sciences related to healthy soils and to healthy plants. And there's, of course, an interaction between those two. And then because I'm a ruminant nutritionist, I was trained about the sciences regarding healthy animals. And there's interactions between those as well. And then starting, about 13 years ago, I began my own personal health journey and study about human health and nutrition. And the beautiful thing for me is that there's interactions between all of these. And so for 10 years now, I've been writing and talking about something that I call grass-based health. It's fair to introduce you to who I am. I'm an advocate for therapeutic carbohydrate reduction and ruminant animal agriculture. I get to speak to audiences of various kinds, and a lot of them have no agricultural background, and I have to explain that the taste test is not part of a hay judging contest. I've worked in forage agriculture for most of my adult life. I presently work for a forage seed company in Tangent. I'm not representing that company tonight, but you should know my background and potential biases. It's only fair. Because as they say, show me a man without a point of view and I'll show you a corpse. We all have a point of view, and unfortunately, for the last half century or so, we haven't been really good at declaring our points of view and potential conflicts of interest when it comes to some of these subjects that I'll touch on tonight. But I think for us, our calling, we have an opportunity, and I think we have really good news to carry to the communities that we're a part of, as well as to the wider world. There's a lot of people who are struggling with the burden of chronic metabolic disease. There's real needs in this world that we could dramatically impact. And so this is part of my mission. This is a quote that I got from a paper written by a professor at University of Florida. He grew up in Nigeria. In fact, he's trying to get home now for his father's funeral. The notion that raising livestock and consuming animal source food, which would be milk, dairy products, meat, eggs, fish, the notion that that is fundamentally incompatible with sustainable development is flawed. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in this world, and yet we have people who are suggesting that animal source food production and consumption must be in some way diminished or gotten rid of in the name of some sustainability goal. And this gentleman has a different perspective in that he works in Africa. The title of the small print says Animal Source Food, Sustainability Problem or Malnutrition and Sustainability Solution. Perspective matters. And too many of our conversations are sort of focused around our experience in high income countries, and we're not paying attention to our brothers and sisters in the low and middle income countries. This is just some of the more striking evidence of too little animal source food in the diets of human beings in the world. That out of the 7-some billion people in the world, we have 2 billion that are suffering from some micronutrient malnutrition. That we have roughly 20 to 25% of children under 5 being stunted. That's physical stature plus cognitive development, due to a lack of animal source food in their diet. A third of women of childbearing age globally are anemic. And again, this is due to too little animal source food. Girls who are stunted, who grow up to be mothers, end up having stunted children. So now we've got an intergenerational issue. When I was growing up, the concern was overt famine. Today, we still have 700 to 800 million people in the world that are calorically undernourished, but we've got 2.2 billion people in the world that are overweight or obese. So that's 3 billion people in the world that are malnourished. And again, that's out of 7.5 billion people. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. If you'd like to, this is one, it's an entire issue of this journal, Animal Frontiers, and the title is Foods of Animal Origin, a Prescription for Global Health. There's some really great pieces of information in there. Pastor Steve and I can figure out how to get this information, so you don't need to worry about writing things down. I share everything because that's my role, is to convey information. So you need to be able to go check out whatever I say. Here's a way to look at it. There are more human beings that live inside this circle than outside of it. And there's a lot of water in that circle. So as we're thinking about global issues, we need to make sure that we're thinking properly about where we are currently as well as where we hope to get. So again, I told you that my bias is I'm advocate for ruminant animal agriculture, but we can't feed today's world without ruminant animal agriculture, let alone the world of 2050. And we have to improve efficiency and productivity of ruminant animal agriculture systems globally. These are just, I would suggest, objective facts, but we could discuss that. In 29 years, it's going to be 2050. That's remarkable. And I had to edit this slide because it used to say in 30 years. The world population is projected to reach over 9 billion. The numbers vary, but essentially 2 billion more people. That's going to require a doubling of global food production. FAO predicts that that's going to be accompanied by a 2/3 increase in demand for animal protein. This is undoubtedly an underestimate, but it was their estimate. Obviously, that's got to come from the same land area as we have today. We're not making more land. At the same time, there are other things that are projected to take place, like doubling the electrical generating capacity of the world. As these societies develop, they're going to need electricity. And this is kind of a startling one, that by 2050, 29 years, 70% of humanity will be living in urban areas. Now, US is already past that, but the rest of the world is on that same trajectory. And so that's going to place a lot of impacts on food systems, etc. And one of the things that I try to remind people of is that in the 60s and 70s, we had Professor Borlaug and others leading the green revolution to feed the existing population. And I'm arguing that we're going to need a ruminant revolution, just as we had to have a green revolution. We're going to have to deploy appropriate technology around the world. But again, I recognize that I'm saying this in opposition to a lot of voices that are telling a very different message. So I want to share some information as to why I think this way. And one of my missions is to kind of bridge gaps. I want to be a bridge builder and a connector. And the biggest gap that I see is the gap between producers and consumers. And this was one quote from a woman involved in the cattle industry. And she said, consumers and producers alike care about animal welfare, environmental stewardship, food safety, nutrition, taste. Everybody agrees on those. We might understand them differently depending on our background, but we need to have conversations so that we can recognize there's no us and them. It's all us. We're all in this. And so how can we come to an understanding of each other's perspectives? I said before that there is such a thing as too little animal source food in the human diet. Unfortunately, too much public messaging suggests that there's such a thing as too much. Now, Pastor Steve has been talking a lot about nutritional research and this sort of thing over the last several weeks. When we hear people suggesting that, as apparently we will, apparently there's going to be a release tomorrow in Europe of yet another report purporting to say that red meat causes cancer. And expect to hear a lot of buzz about all that. And it's really, it has no scientific basis. It's hard to explain to people who haven't been digging into it very much, but there really is no high quality evidence that supports that position. And anytime somebody talks to you about too much red meat leads to, and then you could say cancer, heart disease, diabetes, any of the chronic diseases, if you have the kind of relationship with them where you feel comfortable doing it, ask to see the data upon which that opinion is based. But set that off to the side for just a moment. The reality is that 95% of our food comes from the dry land portion of the globe. Okay. But of the Earth's total land area, only 37% of it can produce food. Okay. And a quarter of the, and only 12% of the land area is suitable for cultivation. We call it arable land. So it's a kind of agricultural land, but it's a special kind. It's one that we can till and produce vegetables or grains or legumes or other crops for human consumption. A quarter of that, so 25% of the Earth's total land area is perennial forage and rangeland. This is land for a number of reasons, should never be tilled, cannot be brought into cultivation. And what we can do with that is we can produce high quality animal source food by grazing cattle or other ruminants on it, converting grass into meat and milk and other products. At the same time that we're thinking about that, and we're thinking about those projections that I gave about in 29 years, we've lost 20% of the global cultivated land from agriculture in 40 years from 1960 to 2000 due to degradation and erosion and development, city expansion. So as those people move into urbanized areas, the urbanized areas grow. And they typically expand onto our productive lands. So not everyone has the land use planning that Oregon has. And while people are thinking about impending problems, and it's always tricky to talk about headlines like this because, how did you come up with it? And is it just so overwhelming that people just shut down? It's not my purpose. My purpose is to show that there are lots of issues that we face. And if we only address one, we might make the other one worse. And so soil erosion and degradation, which happens when we till land, especially land that's marginal, leads to the loss of that land as potentially productive land. Even for grassland, it can become so degraded that we can no longer even use it to grow rangeland. And this one estimate from FAO was, and this I think was 6 years ago, 7 years ago, only 60 years of farming left if soil degradation continues at present rates. And as Mr. Chamberlain said, at the turn of the last century, when our soils are gone, we too must go unless we find some way to feed on raw rock, which isn't going to happen. But there's good news. There's really good news. And this was one study, paper just came out recently. I see I didn't put the reference in the bottom. I hope the reference is on the slide. There are people working in things called integrated livestock cropping systems. So in the United States, for a number of reasons, we've kind of separated the two. Farming used to be far more mixed farming operations with several crops and different forms of livestock on the same farm. For a number of reasons, we've kind of become more specialized over the years. And now people are looking at ways to bring livestock back into the cropping systems. And this one particular system in Brazil was a combination of grass for grazing by cattle and then followed by soybean crops. And in this particular picture, this is from Brazil, but they've got trees and a wide spacing in between. So there's different forms of these kinds of systems. But in the study, what they found was it was more efficient in terms of fertilizer use to fertilize the grass, let the cattle graze it because most of the nutrients stay on the pasture, and then after that, plant the soybeans without additional fertilizer. They got the same yield as they would have from fertilizing the soybeans. directly. So now we've got more food being produced from the same amount of land with the same amount or maybe even lower inputs. And we also get some improvement in soil health. So there's some really good news, but again, this is integration. This is not what many are advocating. Unfortunately,
Yep.
too often. Sorry?
Stop for a question for a second.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
Would this be on an annual base that they are doing this every year, or they graze it for a couple of years and then turn it in? In Brazil, well, we just
it can be a mixture, but in that case, I think what they were doing was it was a yearly system, but they're subtropical.
Okay.
So
Right.
basically, they grow 12 months out of the year.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, please just anytime ask questions. And be persistent. I might miss the subtle cues. We hear a lot of conversations about anthropogenic, that is man-made or man-produced greenhouse gas emissions. And frequently people will cite global figures and apply them to individual countries, which is unfair and inaccurate. These are global figures, but you can't compare a non-industrialized country, say Paraguay, where their industry is the cattle industry. There's more cattle than people in Paraguay, for example, to the United States. I'll show that in the next slide. In this case, also, we need to recognize that agriculture is not all livestock, and sometimes people will apply all of agricultural's emissions to livestock, and sometimes they'll even try to do it just to beef animals. So globally, this sector, roughly 24%, is coming from, of global emissions, approximately 24% comes from agriculture, forestry, and other land use. United States looks different. It's about 10%. Okay. But this is just what's emitted. What's remarkable is in the same documents that you get these figures from, they also list the sinks. And so in the United States, agriculture, forestry, and land use sequesters more carbon than is emitted by that sector. So it's net negative already today. And apparently it's the same thing for the global situation as well. So whenever somebody starts talking about impact of agriculture, just bear in mind that these other sectors are where the issue is. And there's another thing that's going on with agriculture, with livestock, especially cattle, and that is they're a cycling of carbon dioxide. So we have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Plants fix it in photosynthesis into carbohydrate. It grows grass. The cows eat the grass. They digest that. Some portion of that gets reduced to methane, which they burp out. But that methane in the atmosphere in 10 years' time is oxidized to CO2. So you have a cycling relatively rapidly, while when we burn fossil fuel in, say, transportation or power generation, that's introducing CO2 into the atmosphere that hadn't been there for a long time, and then that sits there for a very long time. So very different, although frequently people talk about them as if they're the same. But there's another way to look at this. Was there a question?
Yeah, Peter, I was thinking of the podcast of the gentleman you talked to in Brazil. Did they have data on whether there was better carbon sequestration in that year-round, the year-round switching animals?
Yeah, I don't think it's in that particular paper, But that group has been working on that issue. And part of that is soybeans have a relatively weak root system compared to grass.
Yeah.
And the other and grass also produces a lot more dry matter per acre than soybeans do. And that dry matter then becomes leaf litter, covers the soil, and so you have increase over time in organic matter because of the grass crop, and they've studied that for a number of years now. One of the points that isn't frequently recognized is that the healthcare industry has an environmental footprint, and the current epidemic of chronic disease has an environmental footprint. And so this was one estimate which suggests that if the average American diabetic type 2 could eliminate their medication use, they'd reduce their carbon in quotes footprint 29% more than if they switched from a high meat to a vegan diet. And this amount is this 2 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year is the equivalent of taking a car off the road. So this is just from that perspective, I would suggest this probably is of less importance, although it's significant, it's less important than the improvement we'd make in that person's life. But it is there, and it's just not been looked at much up till now. Yes?
Yeah. Could you shrink the print a little bit because it's behind the pictures and I can't read what you're seeing.
Okay. The pictures, are they in this vertical stack next to?
Yes.
Okay. On the left, upper left corner, there's a little, minus icon at the top.
Yeah.
If you click on that, it'll collapse. It should collapse. Mine didn't. There it goes. Did that make it a smaller bar?
No.
Really? Huh.
Yeah, because mine's showing good tonight. Normally, mine has the same problem, but tonight it isn't doing that. So.
Huh. Okay. Sorry about that. We'll distribute the slides so that you can see them afterwards. Okay. I think this has been covered, so I just want to touch it briefly. There's a lot of really exciting information suggesting that virtually all the chronic diseases that you can name have some linkage to what we call hyperinsulinemia, chronically elevated insulin and insulin resistance. And if we look at the leading causes of death, diabetes is the 7th leading cause of death in the United States, and that's primarily type 2 diabetes. But then heart disease and cancer and stroke and Alzheimer's disease and kidney disease, these all have some significant interaction with this hyperinsulinemia. Infertility also, there's a number of other chronic conditions. So my question is, if that's true, then what percent of healthcare is going toward that? And then if we could address that, what would that mean in terms of environmental impact? So this is potentially huge beyond the obvious improvement in human well-being. Sometimes I get a little snarky. I can't resist it. But if we look at the numbers, all of U.S. agriculture is responsible for approximately all of U.S. animal agriculture. All of U.S. agriculture is 9%. Just agriculture alone. U.S. animal agriculture is about 4, beef is about 2. US healthcare industry is 10. And why are we always talking about this in terms of emissions and we're never talking about this? And part of what I want to give people, part of my mission is to give people the perspective that when you improve your health, you are improving the world. And it's reasonable and appropriate for people to be concerned about the environment and other people and lots of issues. As one author said, if you couple legitimate instincts with bad information, you make bad decisions. And hopefully by sharing some of this kind of information, people can make informed decisions for themselves. And part of that is to understand just how powerful it is when we each go on this health restoration journey, because we don't know who's watching. It has that ripple effect. And then we're better equipped to go into the world and do whatever we're called to do. It may be something not overtly related to agriculture or human health, but we do it better if we weren't suffering from chronic disease. And then this is a message, as I've mentioned already, that has tremendous import for the low and middle income countries. I may have waited too long to talk about the difference between ruminants and simple stomached animals. But ruminants are these miraculous animals that, because they have this large fermentation process in front of their acidic stomach, they're able to utilize high fiber, low protein, poor protein quality feeds and create meat and milk and other products out of those. The diets of ruminants are carbohydrate and protein based, whereas our diets are protein, carbohydrate, and fat based. Although some would argue we don't need to be eating as much carbohydrates. So because of that fundamental difference, there's no competition between ruminant animals and humanity for food. That's another story that we hear, but it just factually isn't true. And this quote, livestock sorts food are important if the global nutritional, educational, and economic needs are to be met, and can be used to feed developing countries out of poverty. I like that idea, feed developing countries out of poverty. Person that I was interviewing yesterday talked about studies and pilot programs where they show that giving a family 2 dairy cows can lift that family out of poverty. And we could talk about that.
Peter, did you hear recently? I know I heard it on podcasts, and I don't remember whose podcast I heard it on, but even like in developing countries, giving a child an egg, well, I don't know if it was an egg a day or an egg a week, like just how much that improved their IQ over time. There was, or something to that effect. Have you heard that recently? Or?
Yes, there was some work done where the intervention was to give an expectant mother an egg a day. And now they're recommending that before women get pregnant, they have an egg a day to make sure that they have the body stores of some of these nutrients. But in this case, it was an egg a day, and then while breastfeeding, an egg a day. So they talk about the first 1,000 days of a child's life, which inclusive. And what they were able to do, and I think it was like at 9 years old, they were able to show in testing cognitive and scholastic performance differences in their children versus children that didn't, whose mothers didn't have that intervention.
Peter?
So, yeah.
What about the cultural issues with cattle-based growth or use? I'm saying specifically Kenya, where the heifer project.
Mm-hmm.
My former wife was a missionary there.
Mm-hmm.
And when the family got a cow, the hubby would sell it for booze,
Mm,
basically.
it
But
there,
they got
yeah,
if they
yeah.
got sheep or chickens or something else, that was beneath the man. So they got to feed the family with those.
Yeah, and I should mention, as I'm saying, other people oversimplify. I can be guilty of the same thing. Clearly, there are societal issues that have to be taken into account in whatever program you're deploying. Um, but in some places, cattle and other livestock are the only property women can control. You know, we can't change everything all at once. This is a reality. They then, that's a vehicle for them to improve their status.
Mhm.
So it cuts a number of different ways. It's very dynamic and absolutely, you wouldn't take cattle farming to India, although they have one of the largest cattle herds in the world, and it's one of the least productive. They're one of the largest emitters. Um, you wouldn't take, you know, swine into Pakistan, or I mean, we have to be smart about this, but
Mhm.
livestock and improving the productivity of those livestock systems is essential, whatever they are.
Yeah.
I tend to be a little bovicentric, but that's mainly because where I am. If I lived in other countries, I'd probably be thinking more about other livestock. Um, just some aspects of ruminant animal agriculture, this idea of upcycling. Um, there's a lot of non-usable material that's produced when we grow food crops. So the almond industry in California produces a lot of almond hulls. Those hulls are fed to dairy cows. That's just one example. The potato processing industry in Oregon and Idaho and Washington, a lot of that waste goes into feeding ruminants. So we have this conversion of non-utilizable foodstuffs by us, are feedstuffs for livestock. And not only that, but plant source protein is inherently lower quality. And the ruminants are able to, unlike the simple stomach animals, the ruminants are able to take low quality protein and, in fact, non-protein nitrogen, and that gets converted thanks to rumen microbial activity into highest quality protein for human nutrition. So tremendously important aspect. The subject of income came up already. They're a significant source of income. I think yesterday the gentleman said there's something like 1 billion people globally involved or reliant on the dairy industry in one way, shape, or form. So a significant part of the global economy. Also security, because the livestock in some places are more secure wealth than dollars are. Um, over half of the fertilizer that humanity uses to grow its human utilizable crops is manure. So it's coming from livestock. So there's no separation here. The livestock are essentially integrated into agricultural systems. Over half of the world's farmers still depend on draft animals. So people who talk about eliminating livestock agriculture, you're going to give them all tractors. How does that work? Ecosystem services, grasslands don't stay grasslands if they're not grazed or burnt. I think it's better to graze them. And the reality today is we still have something like 1 billion, something like 3 billion people in the world are still dependent on burning dirty biofuels. And something like 1 billion of those people are burning dung. Now, that creates a lot of particulate, results in a lot of respiratory disease that primarily is women and children. And when you burn the dung rather than put it on your fields, you're losing all that nutrient. So your fertility declines in your in your production fields, as well as the health impacts. So again, without cattle, we can't feed today's world. And in fact, they're not competitive. They actually increase our food quality and quantity and contribute to global food security. So they yield more human edible protein than they consume because of the wonder of ruminant digestion. And again, so when you hear people say things, just, I heard this guy Ballerstedt say this, so maybe I want to think about it just a little bit. I make the point that, again, they're essential. They convert structural and non-structural carbohydrates into fat. As we've already heard, naturally occurring animal fats are not a health threat to human beings. They convert plant protein, I put that in quotes, and non-protein nitrogen into highest quality animal protein for human nutrition. They actually reduce these unstable polyunsaturated fatty acids to monounsaturated and stable saturated fatty acids through a naturally occurring process within their rumen. They produce vitamins that are only available from animal source foods, as well as other vitamins. They increase the bioavailability of essential minerals. They degrade. There are lots of compounds in plants that inhibit digestion and absorption. And in some cases, they actually have been shown to produce harm to the gut lining. They maintain the health of grassland ecosystems. They recycle nutrients, rebuild soil health. They provide these services like draft and byproducts like leather, and they generate new wealth. So in all these ways, I think it's fair to call them essential. Some resources, they've probably already come up, but I just go over. These are books that I recommend freely. Gary Taubes has just released his 4th book, The Case for Keto, just came out the end of December. The first book of his that I read was Good Calories, Bad Calories. Frankly, it would make a good graduate level textbook. Not everybody's wanting to read something like that. The thing I like about all his books is the references are there, the notes are there. So they're solid books to lead you on into additional reading. So Why We Get Fat, What to Do About It, The Case Against Sugar, and now The Case for Keto. Probably this last book, it sounds a bit more personal to me from his perspective. And so people may find that more compelling. Nina Teicholz wrote a book called The Big Fat Surprise, Why Butter, Meat, and Cheese Belong in a Healthy Diet. And she does a good job of laying out the story of how we came to believe, or at least how we came to have the dietary guidelines that we do. If you're interested in recipes and lots of information, dietdoctor.com is a website. It takes no advertising. It takes no funding from industry. It's entirely subscriber supported. There is, as I said, a subscription, but there's a lot of information that's available for free, so you don't have to subscribe. Dietdoctor.com is one that I recommend to anyone who asks. Dr. Benjamin Bickman is a researcher at Brigham Young University, Why We Get Sick, and he goes into great detail, although in an approachable way, about metabolic illness, hyperinsulinemia, the relationship to various chronic diseases, and then what to do about them. So that's a book I've added to my recommended list. The diet that I started on is the Protein Power Life Plan by Doctors Michael and Mary Dan Eads. You can still get it. It's still available. I think it came out in the 90s, but it's still a solid book. Um, this is a book that I recommend to anybody that would like to check their perception of the world against sort of some economic data. So Hans Rosling, unfortunately, has passed away. His daughter-in-law and son completed the project. Factfulness, and it's really a good book to kind of look at how to sift through information that you receive. One of the things that struck me was today it's estimated that there's like 7.5 billion people in the world, and 2 billion of those are 15 or under. And so the question he asks is, okay, by 2100, it's estimated that we'll be somewhere around 10 billion. How many of those are going to be 15 or under? And the answer is 2 billion, the same number as there are today. It's that more people in Africa and Southwest Asia are going to get to live to be 70 and 80. And so then when people start talking about we have to do something about population growth, there's not going to be more children. So what exactly are you talking about? How we need the information if we're going to have, I think, helpful conversations. This is a book that I recently came across, Robert Bryce, A Question of Power. He also has a documentary called Juice, How Electricity Explains the World. And we live in a world where something like 45% of humanity consumes less than 1,000 kilowatt hours per year of electricity. And that's a large North American refrigerator. So nothing that I take for granted in my life is available to people that are living in that. Something like 3 billion people in the world still have no reliable access to electricity. So these are issues that could inform us to do things to actually be helpful. Sorry, hit spacebar twice. Last thing I should say, and I probably should have said it first, is I'm not a medical doctor. Nobody should take anything I say as medical advice. But I'm happy to put people in touch with information and sources so that they can learn and have more informed conversations if they want to do that. And if you want to find me, I'm available. You can find me on Facebook. I have a page called Grass-Based Health. Same name for a blog. I have Twitter and Instagram at Grass-Based, one word. I have a lot of content on YouTube now, including podcast episodes. And you can email me at peter.ballerstedt@gmail.com. And this, by the way, is the name of a town in Nova Scotia. It's on the northern sort of point of Cape Breton, if anyone's familiar with that area. So.
Well, this is very enlightening because I don't know how many years ago it was stated that red meats, you should not be eating them.
Right.
Right. And now it's the complete opposite.
Yes. And as Pastor Steve, I think, has explained, a lot of that was the product of many factors, but there was never any high quality scientific evidence to support that recommendation. And there's been several papers to explicitly say that within the last 5 years.
So
Still doesn't mean that the political position, and I know with my kids having two just graduated from Oregon and a couple in it, that they all get introduced initially really to a plant-based diet. And
I can't hear it.
they get presented all the negatives of raising animals. I mean, it's real clear to our converted vegans, and they seem they're both very healthy, manage themselves, but clearly it is in a broad perspective of diet. It's just an angle that they've been told, and so information like this just simply isn't presented.
Yeah. Were you able to hear that, or?
No.
Yeah. So, yeah, Peter, do you want to sum up?
I think it was making the point about education, university level, but it extends all the way down. And we have materials being distributed in schools that present the plant, the red meat is bad, the production of red meat is bad for the environment, cattle specifically are specifically bad. And there's a real need to get a more balanced body of information available. And then you're confronting the bias of the educators, and would they be able to deliver that? And that's a whole nother question.
Yeah, my daughter's in high school, and she had the same thing happen in her health class. And I said to her, well, if you need to have me talk to the teacher, I'll talk to the teacher.
Oh, no, Dad, please don't. No, please.
Yeah, exactly. But I think one of the things we don't recognize about this is that when schools do things like Meatless Mondays, or, I don't think they've done it in Oregon maybe, but in other states they've used some of those kind of things, that the lowest income kids who are relying on the school to provide food for them to be fueled and have good brain development and all that stuff, they're the ones that suffer the most when kind of the elite make a decision that affects everybody that's in the school. And I think that's one of the pieces we don't always recognize in that. It's fine for you to make that decision for yourself, for your own family, but when you start making that decision on behalf of all the families who maybe don't have that choice, then it becomes a bigger issue.
I think the most difficult thing, there's not an open discussion about a lot of those. It's put aside and won't be considered as valid or reputable, and because of information that's been put out. Because listening to him today is I haven't heard that prior.
Yeah.
Especially the subtlety of it.
Right. Well, and really that's part of why I asked Peter to come and speak, because I mean, this is what he's been spending his time doing. This is what he spends lots of time learning about, and he presents it in such a clear way. And he claims it's biased, but I think he also presents it in a pretty unbiased way, to help you kind of understand what he's talking about. Yeah. Anna, what's your question?
Well, my question is back to Brazil. Well, actually, what do you know, Peter, about land fallow here in the United States or Canada? I read some article here a few years back that some farmers had done that every 7 years, rotating their crops in cover crop, and that after I think 5 years of doing that, they're up to spending less money, no money on fertilizer, and they're getting the equal amount of profit, but it takes a few years to get that rotation going. Is that something that's still going on, or is that stopped?
Did everyone hear that? Okay, I'll try to capture it. The questioner asked about fallow and cover cropping and leaving land unproductive or not in production, and then after a period of time coming back and being able to produce crops with less inputs and greater profits. There's a couple things in there I'll unpack. In Eastern Oregon, in parts of Eastern Oregon, in parts of the high plains, they practice something called summer fallow, which was keeping vegetation from growing on a field to allow some moisture to build up so that maybe they could have enough moisture for a wheat crop. And that would be maybe every year, maybe every other year they would do that. Now there's lots of problems with wind erosion and things there, and that's becoming less and hopefully less and less of a practice. So fallow, leaving land unproductive, isn't really what I would call it. Cover cropping is an idea where you're going to have some growing plants on and in that soil for as much of the year as you can, whatever the climate permits. So for example, you have corn, you harvest the corn. Before or at harvest, you plant something else in that field so that it's growing then for the rest of whatever season is left. It overwinters, is growing in the spring, and then they'll come back in to whatever the next crop is. The idea again is to keep the soil covered and also keep growing roots in the soil for as long a period of time. That's something that has gained a lot of attention and practice over the last decade. And I expect to see that continue. And then the point that seems to be the final piece to really see improvement is when they start bringing grazing animals into those systems to graze those cover crops. Because most of those cover crops are what we would have called forage crops before. They're annual grasses, they're annual legumes. Legumes, because of microorganisms in their roots, can fix nitrogen from the air. It then becomes available for non-leguminous crops to use as fertilizer. So those systems are in practice. The problem with any grain crop or any crop like that is you're exporting nutrients, and a significant amount of nutrients. And so you harvest them from the field, they go to the city. What happens to them, especially when they're not very digestible in the humans that you're feeding? So we have this nutrient transfer system that it's kind of broken at this point, but I don't know how that gets fixed.
Question. I don't know if you guys noticed it so much, but there's been a huge influx of nut crops, hazelnuts.
Yes.
Now, how does that affect the cover crops and stuff that they used to have there compared to an orchard setting
Or the grazing.
or the grazing?
Yeah. So the point was made about all the hazelnut orchards that are going in the valley.
Yeah.
And that's an issue in the seed industry, because a lot of, as you mentioned, a lot of the seed fields, the grass seed fields, are going out of seed production and going into hazelnut production. And I guess that's what, a 40-year crop at least. I doubt that we'll see those fields come back into grass seed production. The question of what's driving all that, I've been told that some markets would take everything that we produce and still be looking for more. So apparently it's a good market. Then there are the claims that people make about, seeds and or the health benefits. Yeah, I don't think there's a good story there. I don't think it's well founded, but that's the story that's moving a lot of the product.
I thought there was concern with disease on some of the filbert crops, hazelnut crops that had been planted historically, and they were bringing in another strain or a variant that would be more resistant. And so maybe they're not replacing, but adding if those will go away. I mean, that's part of what I hear.
Yeah, I mean, I know the point is about diseases on filberts and planting new strains. I knew at one point of a farm on 99 between Corvallis and Monroe, where they were doing tissue culture to propagate these strains of filberts, and multiplying those and doing it in a way so that they would be disease free, and then they would be planting them out. A similar thing to what they had done with potatoes in this region. So you have disease free propagation. I don't know. I think there's been, I remember going back a long time. So I joined Oregon State in '86. At that time, there was some concern about an ornamental filbert being a alternative host for this disease on the commercial filberts. I vaguely remember that. There's probably some kind of phytosanitation going on where they're trying not to bring plant material into the region, but beyond that, I don't know anything more.
So Peter, why do we have all these sheep on all these fields, and what do we do with all these sheep? What are the farmers doing with all these sheep?
We can't afford to eat them.
Well, yeah. So one of the reasons for grazing seed fields in the winter and spring is to manage the canopy, to keep the vegetation down, to favor reproductive, the seed production. So grass plants are made up of what we call tillers. Some are reproductive, some are vegetative. And by keeping those fields eaten down and not letting a lot of material accumulate, you can favor seed production. It works for the sheep farmer because it's a ready source of feed. And then those lambs get sold. I don't think we have in Oregon a commercial plant for lamb. I think it has to go somewhere else, or if there is, it's, I think, more Columbia Basin area. So that's been a challenge, or at least it was years ago when I was more aware of it, a challenge in the sheep industry.
Are the sheep still coming from Montana?
Some might be, but some may be coming out of the mountains or from the coast, foothills, or they're coming from Eastern Oregon over. They leave higher pasture. It's far better feed than they would have been on back in their home range. Mm-hmm. But they're probably not bringing mama over. They're just bringing the lambs over.
Yeah. Any other questions?
How about fish? A lot of people eat fish.
Yep.
Ocean is probably 2/3 of the Earth's surface is ocean, and it's full of fish.
Yeah.
So how does that equate into this?
So the question was about fish, and I showed that one table that said 95% of our food comes from the land. So it's an important source. There's been some interesting theories about the role of fish in terms of humanity's evolution. So critical importance. There are issues with wild stock harvesting, so depleting of that resource. Yes, the point was made, 2/3 of the Earth's surface is ocean, but the fish aren't evenly distributed throughout that. They tend to be concentrated in areas. There's aquaculture as something that people are working on. There are issues with that industry. I was introduced at one conference to a system where essentially the water that they were using was going through their own sort of on-premises treatment facility and then coming back in, so that their water footprint was pretty low. And actually, I think they were growing caviar, actually, now that I think of it. So they had a high value product that could support them doing all this work. They were entirely on land. They weren't doing anything in estuaries or bays or things. There have been some problems in other parts of the world where these operations get very concentrated. And so then you have nutrient loading issues, and there are issues that need to be worked out there. But clearly, fish and shellfish are going to remain an important source of animal source food. Absolutely.
Yeah, the problem with most of our farm fish is they get fed grain like everything else, and then they become not as healthy as they would have been in the wild. I mean, that's kind of the same piece of that. Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you much.
Thank you very much.
Welcome. Thanks for listening.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, yes.
No, that was, I saw those slides. And I thought, how do you get through that in an hour? And you did it. So it's amazing. Yeah. No, thank you very much. That was very good. Is there any other questions?
Thank you.
No other questions? Okay. Well, good night, everyone. We'll see you next week. We'll continue the conversation. We might move to kind of some more practical stuff. I think I want to talk just a little bit more, probably next week, about the whole hyperinsulinemia thing, because we throw that word around, but I don't know that we all know what that means. And you know, once again, I've heard some stuff this week about it that I think it's worth repeating, because I think it'll help enrich the conversation some too. And even what you should be asking your doctor, even though your doctor won't know what you're talking about either, probably. It's actually true. Okay. Good night, everyone. Thank you again, Peter. And we appreciate your sharing with us. That was wonderful. So
Thank you for the opportunity. Thanks
Thank
for
you,
letting me
Peter.
join